For the first video on GED social studies, I want to talk about forms of government or types of government, the varieties that you might find around the world. There are many of them. The most common form of government in the West certainly is democracy, and the GED social studies course is very American centric, and the USA is a well-known democracy. So a large part of this video is going to be talking about democracy in its different forms, but we will be covering all the different types of government. You can see in this long list that there are many types of government, and indeed there are many more than the 18 that I've shown you here. Remembering with GED, this is not an exam which is all about learning things by heart. So if you're starting to look at this list and think, oh, I should try to learn all 18 of them, that is not the approach. The approach is to listen and to try to understand everything that you're being talked about. But it's not about learning lists by rote. When you're looking at types of government, it's not an exclusive list. What I mean by that is a country doesn't just have one type of government. It will have elements of really quite a number of them. For example, in the UK, we have a king. So we have a monarchy, and but that monarchy is not a strong monarchy. It's a constitutional monarchy. We're also a democracy. We happen to be a representative democracy, and I'll go on to explain what that means later on. We have a parliamentary system. We also have some elements of socialism in the UK, number 11, socialist, in the sense that our education system and our healthcare system is offered to people for free. So you can see that there are elements of a number of different types of government, and you'll see the same thing in many countries, indeed most countries. So don't think of this list as an exclusive one, and don't learn it by rote. You don't need to. The democracy is the first main form that I want to talk about. It's democracy dominates the US and Europe as well. It started about 2,500 years ago in Greece, a country in southeastern Europe, a country which 2,500 years ago was the most civilized country in Europe. A really very civilized, advanced place compared to what life was like in the UK, for example. And the word democracy is a Greek word. It comes from two Greek words, demos, which means people, and kratos, which means power, which beautifully explains what democracy is about. It's about giving the power to rule to the people themselves. Now here is a picture. I hope this is clear for you to see. On computers it may be clearer than looking at it on your phone, but it's simply a painting of Athens, the capital of Greece, 2,500 years ago, and a debate that is going on to decide what will be chosen. And the next slide again, which I hope is clear, it may be clearer on a computer than on a phone, is we simply have a map here of Europe. This is not something that you need to know. It's just to help your interest and your understanding. But if you want to know where Athens in Greece is, you can see hopefully the blue arrow here, which is pointing at Athens in Greece. That this is where democracy all started. And you can see there's London, where I am, right up here, where a rather less civilized place 2,500 years ago. So democracy, people power, is based on the idea of popular sovereignty, that the population themselves should be able to choose how they're governed. They can express their will and decide who should be allowed to govern them. that at the end of the day, the citizens of the country, they're the people that are the ultimate decision makers. And they can appoint people to run government for them and remove them if they're not doing a good job. If there are two kinds of democracy. Now, this is important to try to understand. This is one of the key parts of this forms of government that you may be asked questions about in your GED. These two different forms of democracy. There isn't a good one and a bad one. They all have their pros and their cons. But representative democracy versus direct democracy. In different countries, there are different forms of democracy. The way we elect our leaders are different. In the UK and in Myanmar, we have systems that are very different to the systems in the US or in France. There is no system which is better or worse. Different countries choose a different process. But most countries, almost all countries, use a form of representative democracy rather than direct democracy. And let me explain the difference. A representative democracy is where you elect an officer, a person to represent you in Parliament. So you will send from your local township area a representative to Naypyidaw to represent you. In the UK, you will send a representative from your constituency, which is similar to your townships, and that they will go and represent you in Parliament. In the USA, you will elect a senator within your states. You'll elect two senators actually from each state, and they will go to the Senate House and they will represent you, and they will pass laws and make decisions on your behalf. A direct democracy is where you don't have a representative make your decision. Actually, the electorate themselves make the decision. So you're actually voting on policy yourself. In Athens 2,500 years ago, most decisions, almost all decisions were made like that. The people themselves chose to make those decisions. Actually, the electorate in Athens was, in this beginning of democracy, was perhaps not a particularly fair group of people. Only men were allowed to vote. Only men over 20 were allowed to vote. Only free men over 20 were allowed to vote, and they needed to own land as well. So it wasn't a particularly inclusive democracy. Today in Switzerland, they use quite a lot of direct democracy. So Switzerland has a representative democracy, but the people of Switzerland make lots of decisions themselves, and they quite like that way. In the UK, we use direct democracy very rarely, but we do. In 2016, there was a big vote in the UK about Brexit, and we used direct democracy to where everybody had a vote to decide whether we were going to stay in the European Union or whether we were going to leave the European Union. We chose to leave. USA is a representative democracy. But very occasionally, you do get examples of direct democracy in the US, particularly at state level. This representative democracies, I've mentioned before, countries are largely all representative democracies, but the way they vote for their officials are very different in different parts of the world. The US system of representative democracy, they have two houses that you vote. You send some representatives to the Congress, and you also send two senators to the Senate House, and you have a system where you vote for a president, and the people of the US choose the president as well. In the UK, we vote for representatives to go to one parliament, the House of Parliament, and from there they choose their own leader, and it's as simple as that. So different countries have different ways that they choose their representatives. Let's look at the good and the bad things about representative democracy. The first thing is it's pretty efficient from the point of view is we've all got busy lives. We don't want to have to vote every week, or maybe even more than every week, on making decisions about everything. We want to get on with our lives, and much better that we find a reliable, wise person. We send him to Parliament to be our representative. He makes certain promises about what he believes in and what he's going to carry out, and we leave it up to him. If he does a good job, then he will get re-elected again. If he does a bad job, then we'll throw him out and replace him. He's quite accountable. The bad things about representative democracy is that you can get this representative, and when the election campaign is going on, he will tell you everything that you want to hear about what he's going to do. But when he gets into power and he arrives in the House of Commons, or he arrives in Naypyidaw, he might ignore a lot of the demands that he said, a lot of the promises that he's made, because they might not suit his own political needs. They might not suit the needs of the political party that he belongs to. So he goes off the path that you want him to be on, and isn't quite the representative that you thought that you had appointed. Between elections in Myanmar, I think they're every 4 years. In the US, actually, they're every 4 years as well. It can be difficult to make these representatives accountable. And also, if you're sending representatives to Parliament and they come from a whole series of different parties, it might be difficult sometimes to get a sensible majority to actually get things done. Under direct democracy, much easier to get things done. You have a vote as to whether you are going to do something or you're not going to do it. The vote is very clear, and afterwards you can proceed. Let's look at direct democracy and the pros and cons of that. First thing about direct democracy, it gives weight to equal votes. Now, in the US representative system, in the state system of the US, every state sends 2 people to the Senate. If you're in a big state like California, with millions and millions of people, you send 2 people to the Senate. But if you're in a state with not so many people, like Iowa, you also send 2 representatives to the Senate to represent you. So in a sense, the people of Iowa have more say in the Senate than the people of California. But if you have direct democracy, which is simply one man, one person, one vote, it's much more equal. The second good thing about direct democracy is if the people are involved in politics and in making decisions, it's quite good for that participation. It means that they'll often be better citizens. They take their duties as citizens seriously, and it can increase this feeling of community. With direct democracy, you don't have to pay for all these supposedly trusted representatives, because the people can take responsibility for their own decisions. In a sense, it's the oldest, purest form of democracy, the democracy that began in Greece 2,500 years ago. And finally, the good thing about direct democracy is if you're sending these politicians, these representatives to Parliament to look after you, they might turn out to be corrupt or incompetent, put their own loyalty ahead of you. If you don't use them, then this situation doesn't arise. But there are bad things as well about direct democracy, and let's think about those, remembering that most democratic countries have actually chosen to go with representative democracy, not direct democracy. And one important reason for that is direct democracy is really complicated. If you've got a big country with millions of people in it, and you're asking those people again and again and again to make decisions, the organization of the vote is extremely expensive and complicated. In the UK in 2016, I mentioned that we had this vote about the European community, which is like ASEAN, but it has an even bigger effect on our lives. And did we want to be part of the remain part of the European Union, or did Great Britain want to separate from the European Union and go their own way? And we had a big election we called it the Brexit election. And that election cost us more than £140 million, just that one election. So you can see that if we were asking the public to vote on everything, it would be very, very expensive and pretty impractical too. People actually don't want to vote about everything. They're busy. They don't feel that they've got the time. And actually, often there are many issues that Parliament debates and thinks about that people feel that they're not qualified to make the decision. They'd much rather find someone who is better able to make those decisions and do it for him. It is open to manipulation. If you have direct democracy, you have people who really aren't particularly well qualified to answer to see what the right answer is. There can be clever, articulate speakers who are going to manipulate these people into voting for something that suits them, but might not actually be the right decision for the people who voted for it. Often in direct democracy, you find that the same people are the majority as are the minority. What that means is if you are one of the minority, every time there's a vote, you lose. And while it's important to try and do things that the majority want to do, occasionally it's important to think about the minority and what their needs. Just occasionally you need to do that. Under a representative democracy, it's easier to do that. In a direct democracy, they can often feel very left out. And the final one here, which certainly rings true with me in referendums, thinking again about this referendum that we had in the UK in 2016, this referendum as to whether we should stay in Europe or leave Europe, proved to be very divisive and controversial. What you found is that families were split down the middle. Some of the family wanted us to leave Europe, some of the family wanted to stay in. And even though this vote was more than 7 years ago, it still leaves marks across the country between people who voted for us to leave, and in the vote it was decided that we would leave, and those who wanted us to remain. A representative democracy can be either parliamentary or presidential. But before I go on to that, let's just make sure that we understand, because it's vital for GED, that we understand the difference between a representative democracy and a direct democracy. So a representative democracy, by far the most common form of democracy, is where you choose someone to represent you in Parliament. And once they get there, they make the decisions for you. And you get on with your everyday lives. And then when the next election comes along, if you think they've done a good job, you re-elect them. If you think they've done a poor job, you throw them out and replace them with someone else. Representative democracy. And the direct democracy is where the people themselves vote on issues. Not their representatives, the people themselves. So within this representative democracy, which, as I say, is the most important, the most popular form of democracy by far, there are two kinds of representative democracy, the parliamentary or presidential. And I want to explain this difference because, again, in GED, this is important. And both are popular. First of all, a parliamentary democracy, we have that in the UK. In Australia and in Canada, and I think in Myanmar as well, you have a parliamentary democracy. In this form of democracy, people elect officers. So in your constituency, in your particular local area, you choose somebody to represent you, and then having chosen that person, they then go to the Parliament, and they choose amongst themselves who's going to be the leader, who's going to be the Prime Minister. So in the UK, in the last we have the Conservative Party are the majority of people in the UK Parliament, and they between themselves will choose who their leader's going to be, so our Prime Minister Rishi Sunak is actually chosen by our members of Parliament, and the same thing happens in Australia and Canada. A presidential democracy, like in the US and in France, is where the head, the president, often in a presidential democracy, is called a president rather than a prime minister. The president is elected directly by the people. So the people first of all choose who's going to represent them in the parliament, in the Senate, etc. Having chosen those people, the people themselves choose the leader, choose the president, under a separate election. In the US, next November 2024, there will be another presidential election where the people of the US will be asked to choose who their president will be. So parliamentary democracy is where the representatives that you have voted for, they choose who the leader is going to be. A presidential democracy is where the people say, no, we want to choose the president ourselves under a separate election. Presidential democracy. Important that you know that distinction. Now let's move on to some of the other types of government, remembering that they're not exclusive. So you can be a democracy, you can be a representative democracy, and you can have a monarchy, a constitutional monarchy, as the UK does. There are two types of monarchy government: absolute monarchy and constitutional monarchy. Absolute monarchy was probably the most popular form of government if you went back to the Middle Ages in Europe, probably around the world actually, where you had a king or queen, a ruler who had absolute power. He wasn't elected. There was no one to tell him what to do, and there was no opposition to his rule. Today, absolute monarchy is much more unusual. Indeed, I can only think of two countries where there is absolute monarchy today: Saudi Arabia, and a country that you will have never heard of, I'm sure, called Eswatini, that used to be called Swaziland. And I hope, again, if you're on a phone, you might find this map more difficult to see. On a computer, you might find it a little bit more easily. But here are these two countries. We've got a map here of Africa and the Middle East. You can see the Greece that we talked about here, right up here in Europe. But going down into Africa, we've got this country, Eswatini, which is just here on the edge of South Africa. And Eswatini has an absolute monarchy. Saudi Arabia has an absolute monarchy. For your GED, you do not need to know that Saudi Arabia and Eswatini are examples of absolute monarchy. I'm only doing it for your interest and to try to help your understanding. Constitutional monarchies are much more popular. These will often be monarchies that once upon a time were absolute monarchies, but the power of the monarchy has been constrained over time. Certainly that's true in the UK. Once upon a time, our monarch was an absolute monarch, but now our royal family have no political power at all, really. The constitution is much more powerful than the monarchy. So the UK, Thailand, and Japan are three examples of constitutional monarchy. Theocracy. This is a government by a god or priests, where the religious leaders, using their religious laws, their religious book, govern the country. And two examples of that are Afghanistan and Iran. Dictatorship. The ruler has absolute power. He's not constrained by any laws. He can do whatever he likes. It's often not a particularly pleasant form of government to live under. North Korea would be an example of that. Here are some more forms of government. Again, you don't need to learn all these things by heart. I just want you to understand what they mean. So if you read a passage in a question in GED and it comes up, you've got an idea what they're talking about. So oligarchy is where a small group of people exercise the power. In South Africa, when there was a system of apartheid where, depending on your race, depended on whether you were going to be allowed to vote or not. If only whites were allowed to vote, then you're giving the power of the people to a small group, and you'd say it's an oligarchy. Actually, when democracy first started in Greece 2,500 years ago, only males over the age of 20 who are free and who own property were allowed to vote. That's really an oligarchy as well, because you're giving the power not to everybody, but to a small group. Parliamentary, again, we've talked about parliamentary. A parliamentary form of government is where the executive. So by executive, that's another way of saying the leader. The leader is chosen by the legislature, which is saying the leader, the executive, is chosen by the legislature, which are the representatives, and the UK would be an example of that. The presidential system is where the people say, no, we don't want to let the representatives choose the ultimate leader. We want to have a vote about that as well. So in a presidential system, the executive, the leader, in the US example, the president, is actually chosen directly by the people in an election designed specifically for that. Totalitarianism, authoritarianism, almost the same thing, and really think dictatorship. It's a form of government which is very similar to dictatorship, where the state has complete control. And again, not particularly nice forms of government to live under. Other words that you might see in GED, republic. Republic is really all about the country is considered a public matter, it's owned by the people. The political power is held by elected representatives. There is no monarch. Sometimes a country will have the word republic because it sounds nice. It sounds like a free kind of country which is looked after and managed for the good of the people. But actually, when you look inside that country that calls itself a republic, the way that it's governed is perhaps looks a little bit more like a dictatorship, and certainly not a democracy. Federal. The word federal, this is an important word in GED, when we're going to be talking a lot more about it. But what federal means is if you have a country and that country has a number of different states within the country, the USA would be an example of that. In some ways, they want to have the central government to have power to make decisions, because if you have a powerful central government, it's easier to make good decisions. But they don't want the central government to make all the decisions. They feel that actually that it's important that some important decisions are made at a local level. So the power is, we would say, devolved, is given out to the states as well. So in the US, there is a government in Washington, D.C., a central government with the president of the US. But actually there are local governments in all the different states as well. And those local governments have a lot of power over how life is managed in those states, and have the power to tax. And that's a federal government system. If you prefer a system where actually all the power is kept centrally, and again, there are advantages and disadvantages of both, that would be called a unitary system of government, where all the power is held within central government, and local government is weak. And an example of a unitary form of government would be Japan. Again, you don't need to know that an example of unitary government is Japan. What you need to know is when you see this idea of a unitary system of government versus a federal system of government, you'll think, okay, federal means we're sharing the power. to the states. We're not keeping all the power in the central government. And a unitary government is no, we're going to keep all the power in central government. Central government is going to be the powerful government, and local government is weak. Socialism. Socialism is a system where the government will control parts of the economy, maybe most of the economy, and it will own the economy because it wants to. It's interested in social and economic equality. Cuba is an example of that. But actually, in Europe, you can see a number of examples of socialism. At the end of World War II, we brought in something called the National Health Service in the UK. What we wanted to do is we wanted to provide access to healthcare to everybody, irrespective of their means to pay for it. So the government nationalised the health service. It took the health service under government ownership, so that today healthcare is free for everyone. You can go and see the doctor, you can go to hospital, you can have your operations, and you don't have to pay for it. And this is an example of socialism. Most of our economy is a capitalist-run economy, but there are certain areas, healthcare and also education, where the government takes on ownerships in order to provide this social and economic equality. Communism is a more extreme form of socialism, where the state really owns everything, including property, and people are given resources depending on their needs. And an example of that today would be China. And anarchy. Anarchy basically means that the government's broken down completely. It's a form of chaos, failed state, rule of the mob. Going back to this list again, which I showed you earlier, I've got 18 different types down here. You will come across others in GED. You do not have to learn all 18. But what you might want to think about is, if you were in charge of designing your own political system, what would you choose? I suspect that you would all want a democracy. But what sort of democracy would you want? Would you like to have a direct democracy where you make all the decisions yourselves because you don't really trust these representatives? Or is it too difficult and impractical? Would you perhaps prefer representative democracy? Having chosen this representative democracy, number 2, jumping right down to 17 and 18, what sort of representative democracy would you like it to be? Would you like it to be parliamentary, where the representatives themselves choose who the ultimate leader is going to be? Or would you like it to be presidential? Would you like to be able to make that choice yourself in a separate vote? If you happened to have a king, I suspect that you are going to be happier with a constitutional monarchy than an absolute monarchy. But would you like to have a constitutional monarchy, or is it all a bit of a waste of time? Are there, within your democracy, other elements of socialism that you might want to use? Maybe you're a communist? Maybe you think actually, in order to provide real equality and fairness, a communist state is the right way to go. Once you've designed your state, how are you going to deal with the power of democracy? Your democracy, are you going to keep it very centrally? The Japanese, they like the idea of having one place where all the decisions are made, and they have a unitary government. Or do you think it would be better to have a federal government system, a system where you have the power in Naypyidaw, but also you devolve that power to all the different states and allow them to have considerable power in how they run things? There's no right answer or wrong answer, but a good way to understand types of government is start thinking about things like that. Because, as I say, what's important is not knowing by heart everything that I've taught you. It's about understanding it. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to move on to a question and show you an example of GED questions and how to answer them. What I want you to notice, so here I'm going to show you 4 questions, and there's a passage that you read, and having read the passage, you try to answer the questions. What I want you to notice in this is that the answers to these 4 questions can all be found inside the passage. If you understand the passage, then you will be able to answer all 4 questions correctly. In order to understand the passage, if you have some understanding of what I've just taught you about forms of government, you're probably going to find the passage quite easy to read. And that's very typical for a GED social studies exam. If you understand the material, if you understand the syllabus, you don't have to learn it all by heart. It means that when you get given a passage to read, a map to look at, a table, a picture, it makes sense. And from that, you can find the correct answers inside. Let's go through this. So we've got 4 questions. Which of the following signifies the British system? And you can see here, habeas corpus, democracy, Magna Carta, direct democracy. I'm going to show you the passage in a minute once I've shown you the 4 questions. And then we've got the other 3 questions here. The origin of democracy can be traced back to, you might know the answer to that from what I talked about earlier. But if you don't worry, because it's going to be in the passage. Is it Britain, USA, Greece, or monarchy? 3, it became illegal to imprison someone without trial. Which of the following relate to the doctrine? A, habeas corpus, B, democracy, C, anarchy, and D, Magna Carta. And question 4, the Great Charter was signed into law in what year? 17th and 18th century, BC, 500 BCE, or 1215? So you've got no idea what the answers to any of these questions are because you haven't seen the passage yet. The passage is over 2 pages. And I've done that because I want to try and make the typescript big enough for you to be able to read it. Example of a GED social studies question. I'm going to read this slowly through in case you are finding it difficult to read, in case it's not clear. If you're using a phone, it may not be as clear as if you're using a PC. The system of government in the United States is known as representative democracy. In this style of government, people have the right to vote by making their choice known without being threatened. The origin of democracy can be traced back to ancient Greece. The term democracy was coined from the Greek word rule of the people, approximately 500 BCE in the city of Athens. This distinguishes democracy from 1. Monarchy involves the rule of a person, e.g. king or queen. 2. Aristocracy involves an oligarchic rule of an elite class, e.g. barons, lords. Theocracy, the rule of the church, religion. Anarchy, the rule of the mob, absence of organized government. 5. Authoritarian, the rule by a dictator or military rule. 6. Direct democracy, as to do with the Athenian democracy, whereby all laws are voted on by the council of all the citizens. But only free landowning men over 20 years old were allowed to vote. The historical basis of the US government came from the British system of government. One part of the system is the signing in 1215 of a great charter which is known as the Magna Carta in England. During the same period, it was illegal to imprison someone without granting them trials. This was as a result of the development of a doctrine known as habeas corpus. In the 17th and 18th century, democracy had spread to other European countries like England, France, and Holland. The emphasis of this new bill is on human rights and to encourage government by the people. Philosophers like Adam Smith, John Locke, and Voltaire also influenced US democracy. So having gone through that, let's go back to the questions and see if we can answer them. So question 1, which of the following signifies the British system? Now, if you remember in the passage, it does talk about the British system and how the American system came from the British system. Let's see if we can find where it talks about this. And I can't see it here, but I think you'll see on the second page, it says, the historical basis of the US government came from the British system of government. One part of the system is the signing in 1215 of a great charter, which is known as the Magna Carta in England. We go back to this question here. Which of the following signifies the British system? I think that means that the answer is Magna Carta. Do you see how I got to that? Do you see how the answer is in the passage? If you understand the passage, you can answer the question. You don't need to know that the British system, the Magna Carta, is an important part of the British system. It tells you in the passage. GED exam questions are so often like this. Let's now move on to the next three questions. So question 2, the origin of democracy can be traced back to, some of you might already remember the answer to this question, but you don't need to remember it because it's in the passage. If you understand the passage and you can find it in the passage, you can answer it correctly. And here you can see in paragraph 2, the origin of democracy, it's asking you about the origin of democracy in the question 2, what can be traced back to ancient Greece. So when we come to here and it says, the origin of democracy can be traced back to Britain, USA, Greece, and monarchy, hopefully you're going to think, okay, that's C. So the answer to question 2 is C. Question 3, it became illegal to imprison someone without trial. Which of the following relate to the doctrine? Prison without trial, doctrine. Look, think about those key words, and let's see if we can go to the piece and find out which one it is. Habeas corpus, democracy, anarchy, or Magna Carta. Again, going to the piece, and we see here, during the same period, this is the paragraph starting at the historical basis. If you go to during this on line 3, the sentence starting, during the same period, it was illegal to imprison someone without granting them trials. This was the result of the development of a doctrine known as habeas corpus. So illegal to imprison someone, doctrine, habeas corpus. So it's hopefully you can all see that the answer to question number 3 is A, habeas corpus. You didn't need to know that because it's all in the passage. If you understand the passage, then you're going to get the answer right. And question 4. The Great Charter was signed into law in what year? A, 17th, 18th century, B, BC, C, 500 BCE, or D, 1215. The Great Charter was signed into law in what year? The historical basis of the US government came from the British system of government. One part of the system is the signing in 1215 of a Great Charter. Going back to the question again, the Great Charter was signed into law in what year? The British system of government, second sentence here, beginning, one part of the system is the signing in 1215 of a Great Charter, which is known as the Magna Carta. So the answer to question 4 is D, 1215. So can you see with all 4 of those questions that the answers are all in the piece, in the passage? If you understand the passage, then you're going to be able to get 4 out of 4. That is GED Social Studies for you. What I'm going to do in the next series is I'm going to start to go through US history. There is a lot to cover in US history, so I'm going to do a series of talks running right through from the discovery of America by Christopher Columbus right up until the modern day.